Hi, what's poppin'? It's your boy Big Rich, Queens, New York City, where we get busy. Tuesday afternoon business, Mob Story Season 3. I just want to take this moment to thank everybody that supports us, sends in articles for me to read. I appreciate it. All I can say is thank you, all listeners and subscribers interested in sending articles and information to help the platform and expand our content. Please email me at mobstories87@gmail.com. Ladies and gentlemen, come on in, wipe your feet on the rug, throw some smoke in the atmosphere. I just lit up a little bit of biscotti. Delicious. It tastes just like biscotti. What do you, amazing. Let's get right into it. First of all, I want to salute my boy Salvatore Sally Green for sending me this article. This is coming from the West Coast, written by Andrew Dubbins, and it's coming from altaonline.com. Of course, we'll put a link in the description box. And again, salute to Andrew Dubbins, who wrote this article, and I will have the link to the article in the description box. Let's get right into business. When the Mafia came to Lodi, Joe Bonanno was a notorious mob boss. Lou Peters was a car dealer who long wanted to be an FBI agent. A money laundering scheme had disastrous consequences for both of them. Again, written by Andrew Dubbins. Lodi is a small farming town in California's fertile San Joaquin Valley, east of I-5, between Stockton and Sacramento. The town has a Spanish-style arc spanning its quaint main thoroughfare, a proud history of wine cultivation, and a large number of car dealerships, partly because farmers are sometimes paid in lump sums to tend to like to splurge on new vehicles. Back in the 1970s, Lodi's Cadillac dealership, Peters' Pontiac Cadillac GMC, was thriving. The decade was a tough one for the auto industry. The oil crisis, stricter emissions, and safety standards, but owner Lou Peters was weathering the storm. Personable and hardworking, he had earned promotions at the corporate offices of General Motors in Detroit before purchasing the Lodi dealership in 1970. Over the next 6 years, Peters boosted sales volume by 500%. For a stretch that decade, his dealership was the largest Cadillac distributor in California. Peters resided in a plush home in Lodi with his wife and 3 daughters. He was prosperous, successful, and comfortable. Then in June 1977, a local real estate developer walked into 45-year-old Peters' wood-paneled office behind the showroom. Quote, "I have some people that want to buy your agency," he said. "It's not for sale," Peters told them. "But name any price," the man said. "They've got all kinds of money." Peters figured his dealership was worth $1 million, so he threw out a wild figure just to test the guy. $2 million, Peters said. The developer came back a couple of days later. They said that $2 million is okay. For Peters, who'd grown up poor in rural Maine, $2 million was a fortune. But first he insisted on knowing who was behind the deal. The developer said the buyer wished to remain anonymous. But Peters, as you might expect from a car salesman, was the persistent type, and he kept pushing until the developer finally revealed the buyer. Have you ever heard of Joe Bonanno Sr.? Peters hadn't. He's the head of the Mafia for the whole United States. Peters was stunned. What in the hell was the Mafia doing in a nice place like Lodi? He told the developer, "If I'm going to deal with these people, I'm going to deal with them direct." The developer agreed to set up a meeting. 3 days later, Peters made the 90-mile drive to San Jose, where a thick summer marine layer often rolls in from the Pacific over the Santa Cruz Mountains. There he met with Bonanno's 2 sons, Salvatore and Joe Jr., at a construction company they owned. The real estate developer was an acquaintance of Salvatore's. Salvatore Bonanno was hefty in his middle age, quick-witted and articulate. His little brother, Joe Jr., was less sharp but handsome and gregarious, a former rodeo rider fond of drag races and demolition derbies. They told the Peters they were looking to spend $30 million to $40 million on a string of car dealerships in California. They offered him a salary of $100,000 a year to identify and purchase 12 to 14 dealerships. They'd supervise the operation and provide the cash, but it would have to be Peters' name on the paperwork, not theirs. It dawned on Peters the Bonannos were trying to launder money through California car dealerships, and they wanted Peters as their front man. But he wanted no part in such a scheme. Peters despised the Mafia. Once they get into town, he'd later say, they're just a bunch of animals that take advantage of everyone and everything that they can. Peters ended the meeting without giving the brothers an answer. He jumped into his Cadillac, drove straight to his friend Mark Yates, the Lodi's police chief, and recounted what had happened. A disgracia! Oh my God, Yates said. Lodi, for the most part, was a peaceful town. Sure, you got the occasional rowdy drunks, drug users, or break-ins. There had even been a handful of murders in the past decade, but nothing like the Mafia. This is too big for me, Yates said. He alerted Special Agent Bob Anderson and the FBI Stockton office, an outpost of only 4 agents. Because of its location between San Francisco and Reno, the federal investigators there handled mostly interstate crimes like transporting stolen property. Anderson had never worked on an organized crime case, but he was well aware of Joseph Bonanno, nicknamed the Old Man, and Joe Bananas by detractors. Bonanno had immigrated to the United States from Sicily in 1924 and became the boss of one of New York's infamous 5 families. As a Mafia leader, he'd been suspected of dispatching hitmen to kill rivals, snitches, and other enemies. His criminal career stretched from Prohibition to the late 1960s when, according to organized crime investigators, 2 rival bosses learned he was scheming to assassinate them in a plot to become the nation's supreme mob boss. In response to the treachery, the Mafia's ruling committee, known as the Commission, agreed to spare Bonanno's life in exchange for his ceding control of his crime family. Stripped of his power, Bonanno chose to retire in Tucson, Arizona. Although Bonanno had been investigated for crimes ranging from illicit gambling to loan sharking to heroin trafficking, the FBI had never managed to convict him. Bonanno even appeared in a Parade magazine article in which the aging Don, said to have inspired Marlon Brando's character in The Godfather, gloated about the FBI never having caught him. But of the difficulty was that many of the Bonanno's most lucrative bosses were conducted by registered or otherwise legitimate companies. The FBI had tried to turn many of the people running these operations, but failed. Maybe Peters would be different, Anderson thought. Anderson invited Peters to meet at his office near the deepwater port of Stockton with its big, smoky, belching cargo ships and rusty World War II submarine moored on the steel gray waters. The special agent, who previously worked in the FBI's Dallas office investigating the Kennedy assassination, showed Peters' picture of Salvatore Bonanno and Joe Jr., less savvy criminals than their father. Both brothers were on probation after serving prison time for an extortion charge. Salvatore owed the IRS about $500,000. Peter was able to identify Salvatore from his picture, but wasn't sure about Joe Jr., whom he'd met only briefly. Anderson asked Peters whether he'd be willing to go undercover to gather information on the Bonannos. He cautioned that the operation might take years and that it could be dangerous. Peter said he needed the night to think about it. He went home and asked his wife Marilyn, but secretly he'd already made up his mind. Having served in the Marine Corps, becoming a successful businessman, and raised a family, Peter had checked off all his goals in life, except for one, becoming an FBI agent. He'd been jailed for a petty theft as a teen back in Maine, siphoning gasoline from a stranger's car after his own ran out, so he assumed he'd never passed the Bureau's background check. Marilyn was scared for her husband, but accepted the logic. If I don't do it, who else will? In the morning, Peters told Anderson, I'm in 100%. Over the next 3 years, with no formal training, only his wits, the Cadillac dealer would sacrifice his marriage and risk his life to become the first private citizen to infiltrate the American Cosa Nostra. The old man, a sun-tanned, silver-haired 72-year-old, lived in a custom-built brick house in the upper-middle-class neighborhood of Tucson. He was lonely in his retirement. His sons were in and out of prison. He felt hounded by overzealous law officers and misrepresented by reporters. His friends had abandoned him. He considered building a bocce ball court but had nobody to play with. His only company in Tucson was his ailing wife, Faye, and his loyal black and tan Doberman, Greasy. Periodically, he'd visit his sons in San Jose. Salvatore, his oldest, had moved to the city a decade earlier from New York to be closer to his wife's family, and Joe Jr. had followed. The old man liked California. He fondly recalled his first cross-country road trip in the spring of 1941. The feeling of freedom and adventure while driving out west from New York with his family in the car that embodied the best of America in its power, style, and beauty, the Cadillac. They traveled through Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah before arriving in California, a place of sea breeze and big sky and opportunity. Now the old man found himself considering a business opportunity. It was over dinner at the gazebo in Los Gatos in the summer of 1977 with Salvatore and his son's new friend, Lou Peters. The old man was impressed by the Cadillac dealer's success and credentials and felt he'd make a good partner for Salvatore. "I'm glad you got together," he said in his thick Sicilian accent, putting his hand on Salvatore's and Peter's shoulders. "You're both gonna make a lot of money." In March of this year, the writer called Peter's FBI handler, a former special agent, Bob Anderson. He's in his 80s now, living in Roseville, California. They talked on the phone because his retirement home wasn't allowing visitors owing to the COVID-19 pandemic. Quote, "You're catching us at the end of our time," unquote, he told the writer. Much has been written about the Bonannos, including a bestseller by Gay Talese called Honor Thy Father, which was based on a cover story for Esquire, and memoirs by Joseph Bonanno, a man of honor, Salvatore Bonanno, Bound by Honor, and Salvatore's wife, Rosalie Bonanno, Mafia Marriage, which would make you question the sincerity of the Mafia's code of silence. Exactly. I also collected court records related to the Bonanno's investigations from the National Archives catalog and 1,000 pages of declassified FBI reports through a Freedom of Information Act request. The report paints a picture of Peters as bold, committed, and eager to help the FBI, says one early report. He appears most cooperative in this matter and expressed extreme interest in assisting the FBI in any manner possible. After recruiting Peters, Anderson learned that the elder Bonanno had $40 million in Canada. The money was under the care of a Cosa Nostra member, the informant said, but once Bonanno died, it could be seized by the Canadian government. According to the informant, the old man sought to pass his wealth to his children by laundering it through U.S. businesses with heavy cash flows like car dealerships. Another informant, former mob hitman Frank the Bompensiero, a disgraciado, had told the FBI that Bonanno was far from retired, that he moved west to fill a mafia vacuum and to set up a new crime family in California, but the bomb was no longer available for questioning because he'd been shot to death at close range with a silenced handgun earlier that year. Peters, now working undercover, continued to meet with the Bonanno brothers to discuss the sale of his Cadillac dealership. He posed as a business person who had no qualms about accepting mafia money. He secured an oral agreement from the Bonannos to purchase his dealership for $2 million. But first, Salvatore Bonanno said he needed the old man's sign-off. Quote, "I don't make a move without my father knowing about it," unquote, Salvatore said. Anderson and Peters figured that if the old man forked over the $2 million, then the FBI could prove the money was illicit and make a case against Bonanno. But Peters said they first need approval from General Motors, which owned the 49% of his business. In January of 1978, Peters and Anderson flew to Detroit to discuss the matter with General Motors' executive vice president. After several meetings on the 14th floor of the auto giant's Detroit headquarters, the company's executive boss voted not to authorize the sale of Peters' dealership to the Bonannos out of concerns about bad publicity, legal liability, and the safety of workers at a Mafia-owned dealership. Despite the setback, Peters, who could have won an Olympic medal for talking, continued to find a way to learn more about the Bonanno's money laundering activities. For a while, the old man recounts in his memoir, Peters kept calling on Salvatore just to offer to do favors for him. Any kind of favors. Peters offered to lend cars, sell cars, buy cars, anything at all. Indeed, Peters sold 3 cars to Bonanno family associates and 2 to Salvatore's family. He also sold 3 or 4 cars for Salvatore, including Salvatore's personal vehicle, a maroon Cadillac with cloth seats. The car was brought onto the lot, reconditioned, safety check, and sold by one of Peters' salesmen for $11,000, which Peters paid to Salvatore in cash. Peters reported everything back to Anderson, who coached him on what types of information were permissible in court. The two were an unlikely duo. Anderson was a cautious and meticulous G-man. Peters was a 6'3", 240-pound pushy car salesman with wild ideas. Quote, Peters sometimes wanted to step over the line, says Anderson. One of Peters' bold ideas was enticing a nephew of the old man's, a San Jose commodities trader named Jack DeFilippi, a partner on a business venture customizing Pontiacs and selling them under the name Barchetta. Peters and his sales manager, a former race car driver, had created a prototype, a silver and black Firebird sports car with side exhaust pipes that resembled the famous 1920s and 30s gangster car, the Duesenberg. Peters got DeFilippi interested by claiming that he'd been flooded with orders for Barchettas. Peters said that he'd sell the sports car's patent and distribution rights for $1 million, and DeFilippi promised he can get the funding from the old man and DeFilippi's offshore network, which included investors in Germany, Holland, Kuwait, and Central America. In October of 1977, DeFilippi called Peters home. The car dealer's beautiful 20-year-old daughter answered the phone, and DeFilippi suggested they all get together sometimes. Lou just blew up, Marilyn recalled later. To protect his wife and their daughters, Peter told Anderson he needed to get a legal separation after nearly 25 years of marriage. It's not expected, Anderson said. No one would ever ask you to do this. No, but I'm just stating what I'm going to do, Peter said. Marilyn felt devoted to the case too. She was equally concerned about a Mafia presence in Lodi and agreed to the separation. The hardest part was telling the girls, Peters recalled later. Forced to keep his undercover mission a secret from his daughters, Peter assured them that he and their mom were separating purely for business reasons and only temporarily. Anderson found Peters an apartment in Stockton and arranged for it to be wired with surveillance gear. FBI technicians were lowered into the chimney headfirst to install some of the equipment. They bugged the kitchen, bedroom, phone, living room, everything but taking a leak in the bathroom, Anderson recalls. One tiny camera was installed behind a painting of a tiger with the lens in the eye of the animal. Anderson also rented the apartment upstairs from which he'd monitored the conversations between Peters and their targets. There were plenty of close calls. At one point, DeFilippi, who worried that he was being watched by the FBI, scored the apartment for surveillance and looked right at one of the cameras from a few feet away, but didn't see it. Another time, on a hot day, Peters was wearing a recording device underneath his sports coat, and DeFilippi, in an aggressive tone, insisted he take off the jacket. Quick-thinking Anderson telephoned down to Peters' apartment. "Lou," he whispered, "tell him there's a woman you've been trying to seduce for years, and if you come right now, she wants to have a session with you." Peter hung up on the receiver, delivered the tale, and managed to escape with his coat on. Through Peter's undercover work, he and Anderson began learning the name of one Mafia member or Bonanno associate after another across the United States. They learned that Bonanno and his criminal organization controlled a big chunk of America's cheese and pizza businesses through cheese companies and distributors. Many of Bonanno's dealings were with corrupt business people. "It was disappointing to me," says Anderson. How could a citizen of our country associate and deal with the Mafia just for money? Peters and Anderson were collecting valuable evidence, but the Cadillac dealer and the special agent had a bigger prize in mind. They wanted the old man. In the spring of 1978, the government revoked Salvatore's and Joe Jr.'s probations for their failure to file accurate monthly reports of their income. And the old man traveled from Tucson to San Jose to see his boys before they were sent back to prison. Peter asked the old man whether he could do anything to help during this difficult time, and even attended one of Salvatore's court hearings as a show of support. After Salvatore and Joe Jr. returned to prison that summer, the old man and his wife stayed in San Jose to be with the boys' families, and Peters continued to call and visit the Bonanno patriarch. On one occasion, Peters invited the old man to see his dealership, and Bonanno agreed. He viewed Peter as a friend to his sons and hoped Peters could help Salvatore find employment after his release from prison. Although he viewed Peters as somewhat brash and pushy, totally American in his manners and outlook, he'd later write, the old man was also hungry for a comrade. Peters picked Bonanno up in his Cadillac and they drove to Lodi, where Peters toured him around his showrooms and lots and presented him the Barchetta prototype. Peters urged the old man to expedite the Barchetta purchase, insisting that Salvatore and Joe Jr. would have employment in the manufacturing of the car according to court documents. Bonanno agreed to discuss the progress of the deal with DeFilippi. After driving to Peters' apartment, Peters turned to the old man in the passenger seat. You know, my dad came from the old country, he said. There's a lot of mannerisms and things that you do just like my dad. Then Peters abandoned subtly. My dad, as you know, passed away a couple of years ago, he said. You're like a second dad to me. Peter's dad was a Greek immigrant, not Italian, and as Peters later said, the resemblance of Bonanno's mannerisms and my father's was like a jackass and a human being. But as any good car salesperson knows, you build trust with your customer by connecting with them on an emotional level, and Peters noted to himself that the old man seemed pleased. This professed desire for a fatherly connection fit a theme that Bonanno was exploring in A Man of Honor, the memoir he was writing at the time. Quote, Americans also miss the extended family and are having a difficult time trying to find a substitute, he wrote. Americans yearn for closeness. Most of all, and I say this in a figurative sense, Americans yearn for a father. At Peter's apartment, the old man joined him for a glass of expensive cognac. The hidden cameras were capturing the action as Anderson recorded the live feed upstairs. Peters expressed a fascination with the Mafia, pretending to be in awe of the Bonanno mystique. The old man, perhaps workshopping his memoir, opened up to Peters. He spoke about his childhood in Sicily and the origins of the word Mafia. Mafia is honor, courage, a friend, said Bonanno. The old man could be expansive. He often quoted Aristotle and Dante and name-dropped famous acquaintances like President Franklin Roosevelt, Errol Flynn, and Meyer Lansky. Ominously, he boasted about his outliving a rival mafia boss who had ignored his wishes. He went, he said, and I'm still here. On another occasion, Peter took Bonanno to Stockton's Saturday night stock car races. Straight out of the film American Graffiti, more than 2,000 rowdy car fanatics had gathered for the event. In between races, Peter and his sales manager staged a competition in a pair of homemade Volkswagen-powered cars resembling go-karts. Peter's less skilled behind the wheel than his manager buzzed around the track at an unremarkable 60 miles an hour as the debonair old Sicilian, with a taste for sapphire and ruby pinky rings and expensive cigars, watched in the sand surrounded by fans slurping beer and chewing on snacks from the concession stand. Peters also continued to meet with DeFilippi about the Barchetta venture. DeFilippi was planning to give a presentation to potential investors, but the old man, who by now trusted Peters, said, let Lou make the presentation. By the end of the summer, the Cadillac dealer and the Don had become close. Peters offered Bonanno a Cadillac for his drive back to Arizona, but the old man politely declined. The feds, meanwhile, had been probing Bonanno and his sons on several fronts. In addition to the Lodi operation, the U.S. Organized Crime Strike Force in San Francisco had launched a grand jury investigation into businesses owned by the Bonanno brothers, including the construction company where they had initially met with Peters, that were suspected of being used to launder money. Agents were also surveilling the old man's Tucson residence and twice a week collecting his garbage, which they sifted through for possible evidence. At first, Bonanno's dog, Greasy, barked at the agents when they tried to get near the cans, but after they started giving the Doberman hamburger beef, it warmed to the G-men, wagging its tail when it saw them. Back home in Tucson in September of 1978, the old man received a call from Peters, who said he was in Los Angeles for a convention and wanted to come visit. The old man said that he and his wife didn't feel well, but Peters insisted that it was just a short flight away and that it would be a true honor. The old man relented. Bonanno's driver met Peters at the airport and chauffeured him to the old man's home. Bonanno warmly embraced him. They greeted with a cheek kiss now, introduced him to Faye, then led him on a tour of the house, including his basement office. Cluttered with personal notes and pages from his memoir in progress, the room was, Bonanno said, his sanctuary. Peters scanned for a safe, but didn't see one. Bonanno and Peters then went for a long walk. Bonanno spoke more freely outside. He recently discovered that his house was bugged. The issue was being handled, he said. If there's a problem, it's all over, he added, motioning with his hand to indicate slashing a throat. Bonanno explained how desperate he was to get his sons released from prison. We're pulling out all the stops now. He said that his son's prison sentences upset him. He believed that a nefarious presence was targeting his family and that he intended to find out who. Peters lingered after dinner. He said he hadn't had a chance to book a hotel, so Bonanno invited him to sleep in the guest house. Don't you know you're part of the family? Bonanno's chauffeur told Peters. In the morning, Peters set off to visit Joe Jr. at a prison south of Phoenix. As his informant work stretched on, Peter became fearful that his cover might be blown. After a lunch meeting in San Jose with DeFilippi, who was the suspicious type, Peters returned to his hotel room and discovered his briefcase had been rifled through. Another time, a Bonanno associate drove him to a remote area, and Peters feared it was to bury him there. Then there was an anonymous phone call reported to the FBI. The caller said that he knew about an FBI informant inside the Bonanno organization and that the rat would be murdered. Most frightening for Peters was traveling to Miami with DeFilippi to meet a potential Barchetta investor. Anderson was assigned to shadow him, but someone changed their flight at the last minute, likely concerned about a tail, and Peters got separated from Anderson. Alone in a hotel frequented by the mob, a terrified Peters shoved the dresser and chairs against the door of his room because he was convinced someone would enter and push him off his 8th-floor balcony. Alone in his Stockton apartment, he'd often lie awake thinking of his wife and daughters, missing them dearly. He got to see them only for an occasional weekend dinner out, with Anderson and fellow agents scattered at nearby tables to provide protection. His middle daughter, Lori, with whom he had a close relationship, tearfully pleaded with him, "Are you and Mom getting back together?" Of course, he told her, but he couldn't say when. For protection, Peters carried a pistol. As a young Marine in Korea, where he fought in the bloody Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, he discovered he was capable of taking a life. He joined the Marines because he felt humiliated being jailed for the gasoline theft as a teen and wanted to make amends by serving his country. Now fighting against the Mafia, he felt a similar patriotic duty. In Washington, D.C., meanwhile, Anderson's supervisor was growing impatient. After more than 2 years, the quirky Cadillac probe had produced nothing that he thought could be used in court, and he decided to shut it down. Peters was devastated, and Anderson was furious. He sent reports back to D.C. detailing the numerous people they connected to the Mafia and accusing the Bureau of abandoning Peters. He felt like he may have been played for a fool, said one report, and nothing could prepare him for the shock of possibly being deserted by the FBI under his present exposed circumstances. The reports bought them a couple of more months, but in January 1999, the investigation was officially shuttered. Peters and Anderson brainstormed how to extract Peters from the operation. FBI lingo for severing Peters' ties with the Bonannos. They considered a fake heart attack since Peters had suffered two in the mid-70s. Instead, they decided to get Peters' subpoena to appear before the federal grand jury investigating Bonanno's son. It would allow Peters to tell the Bonannos that things were becoming too hot for him. A few weeks later, Peters was served with a subpoena, and he called the old man from the dealership office. The telephone was connected by wires to a tape recorder hidden in the top drawer of a locked cabinet. With the recorder running, Peters first wished Bonanno and his wife a happy Valentine's Day, then said he had something important to discuss. Bonanno, worried the FBI might be eavesdropping, said he'd call back, left the house, and dialed Peters from a public telephone booth. Peters, quite nervous, told Bonanno about the subpoena. Bonanno asked what the grand jury could possibly want with Peters. Peters, from car sales, knew how to identify someone's need. Was it to impress a girl, win a promotion, fulfill a childhood fantasy? He knew Bonanno worried about his boys. The old man felt he hadn't been there for Salvatore and Joe Jr. when they were kids. Now in the twilight of his life, Bonanno felt the need to make it up to them, the need to protect them. Thinking on his feet, Peters told Bonanno the subpoena might be connected to the Cadillac he sold for Salvatore, the maroon one, for which Salvatore had asked to be paid in cash. The old man panicked. He knew Salvatore was in debt to the IRS, and if his son had sold the car for cash without reporting it, he'd be in deep trouble. Peters, skilled at maneuvering a customer to make the buy, added that he'd kept records of the transaction and asked if he should dispose of them. Bonanno was desperate to protect his eldest son. He told Peters to get rid of the records. With those words, Peters knew what he had: obstruction of justice. He went straight to Anderson to deliver the tape. Anderson copied tapes only if Peters felt they contained useful information. "Should I make a duplicate?" he asked. "Well," Peters said nonchalantly, "you might as well." They listened together as the tape was duplicated. Suddenly Anderson jumped out of his chair. "You got him," he shouted. "You've got him." That spring, Joe was indicted by the federal grand jury in San Francisco for conspiring to obstruct justice. The indictment charged that he'd attempted to interfere with the grand jury probe into schemes to launder money through his son's companies in San Jose. Jack DeFilippi was named as a co-conspirator. He became involved after visiting Peters' Stockton apartment and helping to stash the records of Salvatore's car sale. On March 17, 1975, the FBI raided Bonanno's house in Tucson and ransacked his basement sanctuary, collecting the notes and pages of his incomplete memoir. "Never have I felt so humiliated," Bonanno later wrote. "I can only compare it to what a woman must feel like after she's being raped." Following the indictment, in accordance with legal procedure, the old man's attorney received a box of evidence. It contained FBI field reports referencing a concerned citizen who assisted the government, a car dealer named Louis E. Peters. The old man realized why the Cadillac dealer had been so nice. Peters was a snitch. A disgracia! In the lead up to Bonanno and DeFilippi's trial, Anderson learned something chilling through an informant. A Vegas hitman had been sent to kill Peters. Anderson quickly arranged for Peters to enter witness protection. First of all, I would like to salute Andrew Dubbins for a phenomenal article. Thank you very much. Salute to Salvatore Sally Green that sent me the article. Salute to you, sir. Again, Mob Story Season 3 is a long one today. It's a long one. It's a nice one. Like, comment, and share. Let me know what you're smoking on. And we will talk soon. Salute.